And welcome to DeepDive Talent Insights and Analytics channel. This is I Think I Love My Job. Welcome to I Think I Love My Job. Thank you for joining me. If this is your first time, I am Dr. Kalifa Oliver, your resident expert for all things employee experience here at DeepDive. If you are joining me for another session, thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to having you. So what are we going to talk about today? Confidential and anonymous surveys. Let's go. So I get asked to explain the differences between confidential and anonymous surveys often, and I have found that in many situations and in many organizations, confidential and anonymous are almost used interchangeably, and they shouldn't be. There are impacts nationally in terms of the US, internationally, when you think of privacy and GDPR and ethics, informed consent. There are different kinds of communications and information that needs to go out with your survey based on whether it's anonymous or confidential. I think it's really important, and it's really important to anybody who works within a listening program, does surveys. It's extremely important when you think of it from an employment standpoint, because there are a couple of things that are very unique about the employment situation that creates legal bounds for protections. I know I talked about this a little bit in my previous series, but I figured I'd spend some time on it. Anonymous surveys are surveys in which there is no possible way to identify the respondent. So if you think about an Excel file, there is no identifier at all in the survey that can allow you to figure out who exactly said it. I mean, in any survey, of course, depending on whether you have open text and that kind of thing, which we'll get to, you may be able to make your best guess, but there is no linked way to get it back to one specific person. There's no key indicator in there, whether it's a name, an employee ID, anything. There's no key indicator in there. So it doesn't matter who sees the data set, it's all essentially aggregate. On the other hand, a confidential survey means that there is some indicator in there that ties the survey and the survey responses. So if you think of an Excel file, it will be one row of responses to an individual, and it's tied back that way. It means that there is potential for people who are doing the analysis of the survey to be able to tie it to demographic factors and cut the survey a lot more accurately, to really layer and do comparisons. There are pros and cons of both approaches. Typically, in employment settings, from the time somebody puts in an application to the time somebody leaves the door, and even in some cases after, there are legal protections along the way. And so you have to be careful what you're asking. And this is even more important, especially if you're a multinational corporation with a presence in Europe and UK, for example, because there are data privacy laws and protections that can result in massive fines if you don't spend that time calculating your risk, talking to your legal folks. Like, you need to mitigate what that risk looks like. There needs to be disclosures. You need to have opt-out type provisions, a lot of data security, if there's a breach, you need to be able to report that very quickly. It is a lot of informed consent that you have to think of. Now, from an organizational standpoint, you can do more with an identified survey, which is confidential. You typically will have a very small group of people who can see the full file. There are some organizations now who build platforms that work on top of your HRIS system, so that if you need to pull the data, it leaves out some of that key information, but there is a key variable in it that allows you to cut the data as you need without actually seeing the person's identity. So there are ways to work with confidential data, and you also need to trust your team that is responsible for your listening program and your data collection. Anonymous surveys, people have a tendency to feel better about because they think they can speak more freely and there's no way to track them. The issue with anonymous survey is it's a lot harder to gauge response rates, because in theory somebody could take the survey multiple times. If a link is shared, it doesn't always allow for the best cut-in. Surveys tend to be longer because in order to get demographics to cut, you have to constantly ask, which lengthens the survey, and sometimes that has a priming effect, like, why are you asking me all of this stuff again? This is suspicious kind of thing. Whereas in a confidential survey, because it's tied to your HRIS system and it's tied to the identity in some way that is stored, what it allows you to do is cut all of that out of the survey, and on the back end you can do reporting and do your cuts, and the cuts are more precise and more accurate than it would be if somebody has to respond in a self-report to it. Because sometimes the truth is, when people are uncomfortable, they lie, or they just don't they forget, they hit the wrong button, they choose not to answer. And so there's some trade-offs, right, in confidential or anonymous surveys. Confidential and anonymous should not be used interchangeably, ever. Because if you say something is anonymous when it's actually confidential, you are risking all types of fines. It is an ethical issue. You are betraying the trust of those people who have decided to answer your survey, and they are not getting the full disclosure of how the data is actually being used. It sets a bad precedent, and it should not be done. When you are designing a tool, be very, very, very careful and make very, very strict considerations as to what type of survey you're asking and why. My strongest recommendation for organizational surveys are confidential surveys. Absolutely. And if you do want to start running surveys within an organization, it is pertinent that you have a manager who controls your surveys, because if you're going to ask it confidentially, you need to be able to respect the privacy of those people who have given responses to you, now or in the future. Right? You need to have governance set up. You need to be considerate of privacy and how you communicate so that people feel better. People will always be suspicious. It doesn't matter if it's anonymous or confidential. You'll always find people are very suspicious about giving their data over to organizations, because there's such a strong situation where they feel, if I say everything that I feel, will I be heard? Will it affect my livelihood? Will it affect my lifestyle? Can you identify me? So there's a lot of considerations that you need to make. Some organizations are a lot more, depending on the type of survey, a lot more comfortable with anonymous surveys. But when you're trying to do anything that ties into organizational decisions and executive decisions and things like DEI, you should do confidential. It is more helpful, it's more strategic, it's more accurate, there's less error. But if it's more about collecting the data while you build out a program and you need to go anonymous, then that's fine too, recognizing that there's certain risks involved in the accuracy, and there may be some margin of error, but that's okay too, just as long as you're clear which one it is. Thinking about anonymous and confidential surveys is even more important when you have open text. So it depends on what your open text is. Something that you have to remember when you have open text, sometimes it doesn't matter what you ask as your question in open text. If somebody wants to tell you something and name names and give dates and make allegations, talk about things like discrimination, harassment, things like that, you can't stop them. Once you open that door and somebody can put in that information, you then have an obligation to respond to it and make sure that you have governance in place so that you can escalate it, for example, to your employee relations or your investigation group. Here's the rub though. If you ask an anonymous survey, unless the person identifies themselves in the survey, you can't really do any investigation. It's hard to do it. And then even if they do identify themselves in that open text, because the survey is anonymous, you're in a little conundrum as to, yes, they identify themselves, but what do I do? Because this is an anonymous survey, right? So how do you handle it? All of these things you have to think of. Now with a confidential survey, because of all your disclosures, which can include that if in an open text question, we see evidence of discrimination or any sort of allegation, we can go ahead and escalate to the proper authorities. Then there's informed consent that's given, and that allows you to build. The other thing is anonymous surveys, when you collect aggregate data, you can't do advanced and predictive modeling, not accurately, because there's so much error in that data. You do need row level data, which would mean you need confidential data in order to do accurate predictive modeling and advanced analytics. So again, it depends on what you're trying to do and where you're trying to go and what type of decisions you're trying to make. If you're trying to figure out what coffee everybody wants in the office or where everybody wants to park, anonymous survey all the way. But when you're trying to make strategic executive decisions and business decisions, then you really have to think through your model, and I strongly recommend identified confidential surveys. But it also means that you have to be very careful for everything from communication to wording to informed consent, opt-out, anything like that you need to do. So I thought it was really, really important to make that clear. There are rules, for example, with any surveys. So like I strongly recommend, especially for larger surveys, if you have 5 or less people, it should just be reported in aggregate. Those are the type of reporting decisions you have to make. But as you design and as you think through any listening program, any listening strategy, any type of survey that you're building, please, 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 think through anonymous versus confidential. Think through whether you want the survey to be identified or unidentified. Very, very important. Very, very important. So that is it for today. Just talking about anonymous versus confidential surveys. I hope this has been helpful. I get asked about it so much, so I thought it was really important just to focus on it for one episode. So let me know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I am always happy to read it. Again, you know where to find me. And if you like what you see and hear and you like I Think I Love My Job, don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, there is always room to have a brilliant experience. Bye.